Well, Dee, I think you can go ahead and get started whenever, and then I'll just let folks in as they're coming in. But it's already 11:01, so.
Whichever, because this is a big subject. And of course, it's always been a subject of controversy to some extent, and it's become even more so in recent years. And this has become kind of an ideological football in a way. And so, so if people have questions or comments, you can speak up, or I'll try to respond to that. So just a little bit about the amount of research that's been done on this particular subject. So, so probably, I mean, at the very least, dozens of studies from around the world. Maybe it might not even be an exaggeration to say hundreds of studies, many, in different countries over several decades. So the research science is very robust, it's complex, and there have been all kind of different studies, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute here. But the point I'm trying to make here is that by the very nature of things here, there cannot be one single definitive authoritative study of foster care outcomes. I mean, with this, given the amount of research that's been done here, and given that there have been so many studies, and the studies have had very mixed findings, as I'm going to talk about here, there is no matter what anyone tells you, there's no consensus or generalized agreement among the studies for reasons that I'm going to try to kind of explain here. So this is always going to be, whatever conclusions one takes from this research, it's always going to be a weight of the evidence kind of thing. So if anyone comes back, and sometimes people do, and say they read one study and this study showed something, and either foster care hurts kids or it helps kids or it does, any simple, conclusion like that is not going to be a balanced representation of the research as it exists. So the research so just to say this again, lots of research studies are specific to local communities, or they've been done in a single state, or they've been done from one database or another that's not nationally representative. So for that reason, the studies that I tend to push the most weight on are from the National Survey of Child and Adolescent Wellbeing. So this goes by the acronym of NSCAW, NSCAW. And there have been, so this was a large, hugely well-funded federal study, probably cost more than $50 million in its initial stages. So one of the most expensive longitudinal studies of child welfare really ever done in this country. And part of it had to do with foster care, a lot of other subjects in NSCAW as well. But NSCAW does have a nationally representative sample, and this is why I tend to put a little more weight on NSCAW findings than I do maybe on findings from some other studies. So probably now, maybe a few years ago, maybe even as much as 5-6 years ago, when I looked, there had been more than 80 published studies written from NSCAW data. And it probably is well over 100 now. So lots of studies. And not all of those studies are about foster care, because NSCAW covers everything from in-home services to investigations to adoption to everything else. But a lot of foster care studies in this database. I guess that's what I'm going to say here. I also want to emphasize that foster care is very much of an abstraction. So when people start talking about foster care outcomes, it would be something similar, analogous, if I were to talk about medical outcomes, or if I were to talk about outcomes from higher education, they're very general, abstract terms. So there are many foster care systems around the world, so many foster care systems in this country. So the idea that findings from one study in one state at a particular point in time would be generally reflective of foster care in general in this country or around the world, that's a very naive idea. And so that's why those are some of the kind of the caveats that you have to listen to here when you look at this research. There is, in the early research that was done on foster care outcomes, there was usually a comparison between developmental outcomes for kids in foster care with kids in the general population. And these were studies from 1970s, 80s, 90s, even in the early years of the century, perhaps. And of course, those studies almost universally found that kids who had foster care histories did worse on a whole range of outcomes in both in childhood and adolescence and young adulthood and so forth than similar age peers in the general population. So of course the question there would be why? Because these early studies didn't compare kids kind of within the child welfare system. They compared kids who had been in foster care for some period of time, and then with people in the general population. And so, in order to get sort of more of an answer to the question about, well, what effect does foster care have on kids in the child welfare population? Studies now in the last 20 years have usually, many of them, tried to draw comparisons between kids in foster care and, say, kids in kinship care, which we can talk about here. There's been a number of studies about children who had been open for CPS investigations, had received in-home services compared to kids who were placed in the home. And some of those studies are quite specific. I mean, as an example, one of the studies that's cited by a lot of foster care critics is a study by an economist named Joseph Doyle at MIT that came out in 2007. And his study was very idiosyncratic. I mean, he studied kids who were 5 years old or older and who were engaged in what he called marginal cases. That is, it didn't appear that their immediate physical safety was at risk. So they were kids who, people might disagree within the child welfare system about whether they needed to be in care or not. So Doyle then compared kids who had been in these marginal cases, kids who had been placed in foster care to ones who weren't, and found that in adolescence, generally speaking, the kids who remained in the home did better. And so that's on a variety of measures. And so that study has been used to assert that foster care hurts kids developmentally. And, remember, a very unusual study of a very specific kind of population in which children's safety was not really threatened. Young kids were not included in the study. Any kid that had more than 2 reports was not included in the study. I mean, all kind of kids were excluded. And so for all kind of reasons, I don't put much weight on the Doyle study, but a lot of other people do. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that when you have people summarizing the studies and foster care outcomes, there's a lot of cherry picking that goes on. There's a lot of people they've already kind of made up their mind about what they think about the subject. Now they're looking for research that kind of confirms what they think. And so they tend to think that there's one study that sort of proves that they're right, or one study that proves that their opponents are wrong, or something like that. And that's almost always reflective of unbalanced kind of look at the research here. So one of the things I want to stress, whenever in the future you look at anyone's summaries of research, if someone is looking at foster care outcomes research and they're not being honest about the mixed nature of it, that is, there are a lot of conflicting findings here. And if people aren't honest about that, they don't really have intellectual integrity, in my view. That doesn't necessarily mean that their views are wrong. It just means that I'm not going to listen to them because they're not really taking a balanced look at the evidence. They're not looking at research findings that they like up against research findings that they don't like. They're just sort of ignoring all the research that they don't like and emphasizing the research that they do like. And so that's not a way to make progress toward truth. That's not a scholarly virtue. It's an approach that advocates take who have a predetermined kind of way that they want things to come out here. And so lots of foster care research is sort of that nature. I mean, the summaries that have come out in recent years. And I recently, within the last 2 weeks or so, I wrote a lengthy analysis of an ABA document on the effect of trauma and separation on children's trauma and so forth. And that ABA document is a perfect example of all of these things that I just talked about. It's very much an advocacy document. It's not trustworthy. It doesn't mean that everything in it is false. Some of the stuff the AB document says is true. I mean, some of the summaries are good, some are not as good. But in terms of a fair and balanced look at a complex, it's not that. It does not pretend to be for one. So, so let me just a little bit about what I think are some of the more important kind of findings here. So I guess one of the things to say is that a lot of research on foster care has to do with developmental outcomes. That is not so much with child. So think about the kind of outcomes. Why would we put kids in foster care in the first place a lot of times? I mean, really a lot of times because particularly in the child protection area, we're concerned about child safety issues. Nevertheless, a lot of research doesn't really deal with child safety issues at all. It deals with developmental outcomes of foster care. That is, once kids are placed in foster care, do kids do better on standard developmental measures? Do they do better in school? Do they do worse in school? Do they end up having more indicators of mental health problems or less indicators? What happens to them in adolescence? What happens to them in regard to, for example, involvement in juvenile detention or in delinquent activities and so forth? So all of those kind of, there has been research, for example, on the effects of recent research that have showed a positive effect of foster care on adolescent sexual and reproductive health. You know, that's a very specific kind of outcome that research looked at. And so for that kind of research, this is why I say that the findings in studies are mixed. That is, some findings, some research has found positive effects for foster care, and some research has found negative effects. And of course, to a certain extent, maybe those different kind of findings are reflective of things that are really that only scholars pay attention to, like, you know, what was the nature of the sample? How large was it? I mean, what was the nature? How was it a randomized trial? Was it a quasi-experimental? All of those research design questions, which advocates and frankly, most people or practitioners don't even pay attention to that kind of stuff. But of course, scholars do. And so some of the different conflicting findings in this research may just be due to the way the research is designed, which age group of kids it focuses on, as I'm going to say something about that in a minute here, and how long it follows the kids. I mean, some research follows kids over a period of maybe their entire childhood, and while other research is interested in what happens to them in the next several months or the next year or two, or so. Yeah. So anyway, so before I go any further and talk about some of the specific studies and some conclusions that we may take from those studies, let me kind of stop here and see if anyone has a comment or question here. And you can either put this in chat box or you can just speak up in there. Okay, so a few other things I guess I want to say here, just as something that probably most you would conclude from most of the studies here. Before I get into the kind of the more of the meat of it. So lots of times kids go into foster care for brief periods of time, and much more so than people who are outside child welfare systems imagine. So lots of kids go into foster care for a few days or a few weeks or a few months at most. You know, when I worked in the child welfare system in this state, I mean, about 1/5 of all foster kids placed in foster care left foster care within a week. I mean, a large number of kids go in, have brief placements, but then there are the kids who stay in care for really a long time. And so there has been sort of a finding over the years, or a general sort of trend that that the rate of reunification sort of is inversely related to length of stay. That is, the shorter the length of stay, the more likely it is the kids are ultimately or will likely to be returned to a parent or to a caregiver. The longer that kids are in care, the more likely that they will always be in care, or that they will end up in a guardianship or in an adoption at some point in time. And this becomes really much more dramatic once you reach the AFSA timelines. That is, you know, once kids have been in care 15 out of 19 months or whatever that is, or 12 out of 19 months, whatever that is in this state. Once you reach the AFSA guideline, the kids who are still in care, the rates of reunification begin to go way, way down. And so, that's the first thing. So very high rates of reunification for kids who exit foster care within a year, much lower rates of reunification for kids who exit foster care after a year. And there are also very dramatic, large differences in terms of ages of children. So for example, babies, 1/5 of kids who enter foster care are babies, infants 0 to 1. Those kids reunify. Infants who enter care 0 to 1, they reunify at much lower rates than older kids. I mean, even kids who are 1 or 2 or 3 when they enter care. So probably no more than 1 out of 3 infants who comes into foster care in the first year of life ends up going back to a birth parent, whereas anywhere from 50 to 60%, depending on the state you're in, of kids who are older than that end up ultimately being reunified with parents. The longer that kids are in care, and this is where you start to get real concerns about what happens to kids in foster care and also developmental outcomes, the longer kids are in care, the more likely they are to have multiple placements. So there is a very straightforward, linear type of relationship here. Length of stay, longer lengths of stay are strongly associated with larger numbers of placements. And so that just sort of tells you right off the bat that there is an issue about the capacity of foster care systems. I mean, not just in this state or in this country, but around the world, really a question about the ability of foster care to stabilize children in care, and particularly school-age children who enter care with behavior problems. And so one of the ways that I think about foster care is kind of like a dissected system. You know, I think, and I sent out something I wrote on this a few years ago called Dissecting Foster Care, and as a handout, I sent that to Ryan. He can send it around to you. But generally, the idea there is that it's as a useful kind of a way of thinking about foster care. It's useful to think of foster care for kids who are in the 0 to 5-year-old age range when they enter care. That's about 50% of kids who enter care. I already mentioned about 1/5 of kids who enter care are 0 to 1 when they enter care. And then about half the kids are school age, anywhere from 6 to 17 when they enter care. And so that's a straightforward kind of division. The other kind of straightforward kind of division is that about half of kids who enter care have some pretty significant behavior problems upon entry into care, and about half of the kids don't. So, and there's also kind of obviously kind of a relationship with age there. I mean, if kids who enter care at somewhat older ages are more likely to have behavioral problems when they enter into care. So one of the findings, and one of the studies that I put the most weight on, one of the NSCA studies by a guy named David Rubin and colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, found that kids who entered care without behavior problems, or with very few, that is, if not developmentally normal, fairly normal compared to a normal group of kids in terms of development and behavior problems, those kids were frequently very quickly stabilized in care. And if they were stabilized in care, then they're quickly, that is, within the first 2 or 3 months, then a lot of times they tended to developmentally benefit from care. That is, they were more likely to be stabilized in care, not to experience multiple placements. And even if they remained in care, many of those kids did better in foster care than the kids who were eventually reunified with birth parents. So that those kids who entered care without serious behavior problems, a lot of times they were safer. That's why they went into care in the first place, and they benefited developmentally, and even compared to kids who ended up going back to the birth parent, right? On the other hand, what about kids who entered care with behavior problems? They were much more difficult to stabilize in care. I mean, in the Rubin study, about 30% of those kids, after 18 months, still were not stabilized in care. And using a very loose definition of stability in care, that is, a child who had been in care for at least in a placement for at least for at least 9 continuous months in the first 18 months of care. That is not even counting the placements. Those kids, the ones who were not stabilized in care, who tended to be a lot of the kids with behavior problems, they tended to do worse on developmental measures over time and all along. And so after maybe a year or two in care, they looked worse on standard developmental measures than they looked when they entered care, because the system simply had not been able to stabilize them. I mean, that would be, in addition, of course, other kind of things happen to those kids. In addition to being moved around from home to home, often they can be put on psychotropic meds. I mean, they can end up being, there's many teenage kids who end up actually being abused or neglected in care. So some of the more disturbing studies that have come out in recent years, I mean, the ones that at least have disturbed me the most, are studies based on the self-report of young adults who aged out of care or who were still in care at age 17, 18 to 21. And those studies are from Mark Courtney, from people at Chapin Hall, based on surveys of foster care alumni. And so, quick summary of those studies, I mean, about a third to a half of those foster care alums, that is, they were in care as teenagers for a fairly long period of time, and many of them aged out of care. A third to a half of them asserted that they had been maltreated in care, not just mistreated or poorly treated or unfairly treated, but maltreated, that they had been physically, sexually abused or neglected. And I have found, much to my surprise in recent years, in some states, foster kids and kids in residential care can indeed be neglected in care, and neglected in the most basic ways. That is, not having enough food to eat, for example. That is one of the most disturbing things I saw in recent years, was a video of foster kids in Florida who were in their late teens and talking about their experiences in private for-profit residential care facilities where they had been denied adequate food. So one of the things I've concluded, therefore, in recent years is that when it comes to behaviorally troubled kids, particularly kids who are behaviorally troubled when they enter care, foster care is not a reliable therapeutic system for those kids, generally speaking. That does not mean that they all suffer from harm when they go into care. It doesn't mean that. But it means that in the aggregate, you can't count on foster care being a therapeutic experience for that group of behaviorally troubled kids, particularly the kids in the 6 to 17-year-old age range when they enter care. And we kind of, and again, not probably a mystery as to why that is so, because the foster care systems in this country run off of a volunteer foster care model. That is, the foster parents are not prepared by education, by experience, by the motivation they have for becoming licensed to take care of behaviorally troubled kids. That's something that they have to sort of be encouraged or influenced to do that, in various ways. Then most of them, those foster parents aren't becoming foster parents to do that particular job. So it's not a surprise that they do it poorly, very, very frequently. So I think the most compelling foster care research that I've seen in recent years that is of a critical nature has to do with this issue of foster care as a therapeutic resource or not therapeutic resource for behaviorally troubled school-age kids. And I think there that the sort of the weight of the evidence is that foster care does, by and large, it's not a reliable kind of a way at this point, because of the way it's organized in this country, the way it's funded, and the people who are doing it, it's not a reliable service. And oftentimes, not only in the research, but in the practical experience I had in working in child welfare systems, those behaviorally troubled kids were often, I think, harmed as much in care, if not more, sometimes more in care than they were in their birth families. Even the kids who had been physically abused or sexually abused, a lot of times they were very, very harmed in care, either developmentally, and sometimes they were actively maltreated in care. And not just by the people who took care of them, but particularly in residential care facilities, by older kids, stronger. They were subject a lot of times to bullying. So I got to where When I was a caseworker, a supervisor, manager, I really hated to put school-age kids in residential care facilities, and at least in most of them, because even if I trusted the facility staff itself, even though I thought it was a well-managed facility, they're still in there with kids who are a lot stronger, tougher, older than they are a lot of the time, and they may be taken bullied and taken advantage of in various ways, right? So that's on the critical side of things. On the positive side of things, when you talk about the little kids, on the other hand, it seems to me like a very different kind of a story there. And so one of the studies that I have been most impressed with in recent years, and I've continued to talk about it, was a longitudinal study of maybe 200 and almost 280,000 kids in a birth cohort born in Washington State in the early to mid 1990s. And this study was done by, it was then called ORDA, the Office of Research and Data Analysis with DSHS. And so the lead investigator there was a woman named Lori Cawthon, and along with a colleague of hers, I mean, they followed this group of, remember, very large, 280,000 kids almost, until they were almost age 4. Most of them were almost age 4 at the time that the study ended. And then what this study did was to descriptively track outcomes, including death, early death, for that group of kids. And so, and very carefully, and to look at the influence, for example, of substance abuse, parental substance abuse, on the mortality rates of kids in the first 4 years of life. And so, brief version of this is after the first 28 days of life. So kids who went into foster care, a lot of times in the first 28 days of life, had a high mortality rate because they were born with genetic anomalies. But after the first 28 days, foster care turned out to be a protective factor for child mortality in that population. That is, kids in the foster care system had about the same rates of all-cause mortality as kids in the general population. Whereas kids who had been reported to CPS but had not been, the cases had been screened in, there was a CPS investigation, but the children had not been placed in foster care, died at double the rates after controlling for income and poverty. So I'm going to say that again. After controlling for poverty, kids who had been reported and had remained in birth families died from all causes at about twice the rate of kids in foster care, right? So that study of all-cause mortality in Washington State, that turned out not to be published. And it was not published because of concerns. This is my interpretation, but I was told that this was true too. I didn't just make it up out of whole cloth. That concerns at the top of DSHS around the finding that CPS was not particularly helpful at protecting the life of, from all causes. And here we're not talking about just from physical abuse or from neglect or something like that, but from disease, from illness, from SIDS, from a whole range of illnesses. So that study, I think, is of great significance. And recently, within the last year or so, a very large study in California sort of did a replication of this study on kids who were reported to child welfare agencies in California who had physical illness but were not removed from the home. And so, short version of this, for children 0 to 1, the rates of all-cause mortality were about half for the kids in foster care compared to what they were for kids in the general population who had been investigated by CPS. I mean, of the infants there, right? So there have been a couple of recent studies and large studies in Australia that have found very similar things, or the effects of all-cause mortality on foster care in Australia. Very, very similar kind of findings here. So the idea that I have here is that foster care works a heck of a lot better, has much more obvious benefits, and far less of a downside in terms of outcomes for kids in the 0 to 5 population. And remember, this is about half of kids who enter foster care in the US. And one of the ways that you should understand the US, our foster care system is not like foster care systems in most other wealthy countries. I mean, so it's different mainly because we have a higher child poverty rate in this country. And as a consequence of that, a lot more very young kids, a lot more babies and toddlers are coming into foster care in the United States than is generally true in Northern Europe. So there's lots of, and this isn't a matter of a foster care rate. Foster care rates, generally speaking, per 1,000 are higher in Northern Europe than they are in the US. So the idea that the US has a high foster care rate, this is not true compared to most other wealthy countries. It's true compared to England. England has one of the lowest foster care rates in the developed world, but for the most part, it's not true. But foster care is just used in a different kind of way in most other countries, and that it has a lot more to do with school-age behaviorally troubled kids. And so and it doesn't just have to do with child abuse and neglect, but with other things as well. So let me see, it's about 11:30, so I've already said quite a bit here, and let me stop and see, give you a chance for comments or questions here. So go to if I can find the chat box here. See if anyone has a comment or question here. Okay, I guess I want to say a little bit more. I want to go back to the issues of trauma, child separation. So there has been, I think, in recent years, for understandable reasons, just a growing concern about the effects of perhaps the traumatic effect of separating very young children from their parents, and particularly in coercive kind of ways. So involuntary placements, that is, and I think these concerns became greatly increased, exacerbated, intensified by events that happened in the last 2 years during the Trump administration, where removal of kids of immigrant families at the southern border of the United States, and done in the most brutal, kind of insensitive way. And those separations, of course, a lot of times went on for weeks, months, or maybe even years. And so a number of people in this country have seen resemblances or drawn the analogy between those horrific events that happened at the southern border there through U.S. policy there, with what goes on with the involuntary removal of kids from homes, particularly when they're young. I mean, so a lot of those involuntary placements are sudden, they're unplanned. I mean, someone may just, in theory, show up at a door with police officers and kids can be removed. And so it's common to hear in these discussions in recent years, and we talk about the ideological football aspect of this, is that it's common to hear the assertion that even when the separation of kids from parents is necessary to protect their lives, it necessarily is invariably a traumatic experience. So let me just start off with this one. So that assertion is really never based on studies. I mean, it's based on more ideas around trauma and so forth, right? And so, and I would have to say, it's just, as a straightforward factual claim, it's not true that the separation of kids from parents is always a traumatic thing, and particularly in cases of child maltreatment. So the best discussion that I know about this is from a Vera Fahlberg book, A Child's Journey Through Placement, which came out in 1992. And and Fahlberg did clinical work with foster kids for her whole entire career. And this book is just it's still probably the best practice guide for work with kids in foster care that I'm at least aware of, right? And so what Fahlberg has to say is that the effects of separation on kids, it primarily depends on two main factors. Part of it depends on how the placement is done. And so, and of course, and so the part that is true is that if you want to do emotional harm to kids, sudden, unplanned placements without any transition, that greatly increases the possibility of doing emotional harm to kids. But even then, it also depends on the nature of the relationship that kids have with parents prior to the removal. So remember, lots of kids who are placed in care of babies, I mean, they may be placed in care in the first few days of life or within the first few months of life before there's even an attachment kind of a relationship that's been developed there, right? So, um, and many kids have been, the reason they are placed in care is because they have been hurt by parents or severely neglected by parents in various ways. So the idea that kids are just invariably traumatized by placement, not just not true. I mean, but some are. And so it really matters a lot how a placement is done. And so if you start thinking about, one of the things you always want to think about when kids are placed in the home is what's the process for doing that? Just like we hopefully carefully think about how to move a child from foster care to an adoptive home through a transition kind of plan. If at all possible, we need to be thinking about that with kids who are in families who are going to have to be removed for some period of time. It also matters a great deal about what happens after the placement occurs. So remember, children at the southern border, I mean, they might be separated from without any contact with family members for days, weeks, months, or years, right? So, you know, hopefully you don't have foster care systems that operate like that anymore. You know, when I started off in working in child welfare in Colorado in the 1970s, we had a policy guideline in Colorado at that point that when kids are removed from the home, they shouldn't have contact with birth parents for 30 days. It was supposedly that was a humane way of allowing them to adjust to their life and care. You know, so we know now, after decades of dealing with this, that that is a very inhumane, very emotionally insensitive, very hurtful way of dealing with kids. So of course we want to set up, in most instances, with some rare exceptions, we want to set up very early, quick contact subsequent to removal. And it matters greatly what happens after kids are removed, immediately after kids are removed from families. That affects the overall, you know, extent to which kids are emotionally harmed by separation versus the extent to which they aren't harmed by separation. So let me, before I go any further on this trauma subject, let me stop there and give people a chance to ask, comment, or questions there. If you have
I guess I do have a question. So I'm just trying to get the data for this. This was based on studies that were in the Fallberg book, or?
Yeah, it's based on both studies, but it's also based on her clinical work. I mean, she had worked in therapeutic type of relationships with kids for several decades, and she was did training all over the country. And so, you know, and she ended up moving from Colorado to Bellevue and ended up spending the last part of her life in Bellevue. And so anyway, I highly recommend this book. And by the way, I do want to say that the studies that claim that kids are always invariably traumatized, those claims are not based on studies. Those, you know, the idea that kids removed at the southern border, a lot of those kids were traumatized. Yeah, that's definitely true. But you know, so going back and looking at the traumatic effects, this is something that people are speaking from their ideas about trauma, right? And of course, it's true that kids are sometimes traumatized by removal. That is, of course, true. And we can behave and act in a way in child welfare systems that makes that more likely or less likely. So you always want to think carefully about how children are placed. And so, for example, it used to be common that sometimes kids would be placed out of the home and they wouldn't even be able to take their possessions with them, or if they had pets, they were separated from pets. I mean, there are all kind of ways of doing things that make those disruptions more harmful. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that the emotional effects of disruption on kids depends a lot on those kind of factors. To what extent we're doing things in thoughtful, sensitive ways versus unthoughtful, insensitive ways. So you don't want to, you know, make sweeping generalizations about placement always results in X, Y, or Z. You know, there is no statement like that that's true. It depends on how it's done, the conditions in which it's done, and what happens after it's done. So so. Are there lots of potentially negative effects of children going into foster care? Of course there are. Of course there are, right? So, as an example, in past years, I actually ended up one time was in an office where a child who had been sexually abused in the most grotesque way. We actually had pictures of this, horrible. This child was in the 3 to 4 year old age range, and her mother's romantic partner, had sexually abused this child and had made pictures of it and so forth. And this kid those pictures came to light, and this kid was removed from the mother and placed in care. Within 10 days, our office, remember, we had pictures of this, and there was no question about the culpability of the mother. She was absolutely culpable. We had to return this child to this mother within 10 days because this child was so severely traumatized by this removal, by this separation from this mother. So this child was, becoming ill, was inconsolable, right? So that does sometimes happen to kids who have had very close relationships, affectionate relationships with parents before they go into care. But I've placed many kids in the course of my time as a CPS caseworker where they immediately thrived in care. And it was obvious in terms of their behavior, their attitude, right? They went from kids who, could hardly act or respond to kids who became immediately kind of affectionate, almost like, giving a flower, water, and light or something, right? So I guess the idea I'm trying to get across here is that the effects of placement are highly variable. And back into the Fallberg thing, it matters quite a lot about what's the situation from which the child was removed, what was actually going on in that situation. What was the nature of the relationship, not just what was the behavior that led to the placement, what was the nature of the nurturing relationship between the parent and that child before removal, if indeed there was a relationship. And remember, a lot of times kids in very, very young, it's not the same type of relationship as when kids are somewhat older. So yeah, when kids go into care and they lose everything, they lose their siblings, they lose their pets, they lose their possessions, they lose everything. And then they don't have, they can be very, very severely harmed by separation. So anyway, that's the general idea here. And I do recommend, not just for this particular subject, but for many others having to do with the subject of how do you transition kids from one placement to another. And for anyone who's a guardian ad litem, I recommend the Fallberg book, right? Because kids a lot of times are being moved around in foster care systems.
Is there good evidence about whether kinship placement reduces the risk of trauma? Or, in some of these cases, the kids have never met these people either, so I don't know.
Yeah, there's a lot of studies on kinship care. And so the brief version of this is that kids in kinship care, generally speaking, even after you control for behavior problems, kids in kinship care generally have more stable placement. So the advantage, and so regardless of whether they knew the relative before or they didn't know the relative before, kids in kinship care generally are more stable. So that's the main consensus kind of claim from that research. In terms of developmental outcomes for kids being in kinship care, then the research there is very mixed. There have been some studies that have found developmental advantages for kids who are placed with kin, up against other studies that have found little or no difference whatsoever. Most of the NSCA studies that I mentioned before, the nationally representative sample, didn't find much developmental differences between kids in kinship care and kids not in kinship care. But there have been other studies that have. And one of probably the best of those studies, one of the studies that made the most impression on me was by a group of researchers at a university and somewhere in the Midwest who published this study. So this group was BADA, B-A-D-A, if you guys are interested in looking this up. This is one of the best studies of infants going into care. So this was a study of opioid exposed infants in 4 states, several hundred infants who had been exposed in utero to opioids. and who were then at birth. Some of those kids went to foster care, but most of them didn't. Some went to relatives without there being any court action whatsoever, just on an agreement of the mother. And some of the kids ended up staying with the mothers, right? And so these researchers then had an opportunity to compare the developmental outcomes for the next 3 years for these groups of kids. Kids who went into foster care, kids who didn't, who went to relatives who were not foster parents, and kids who stayed with the parents. Well, what they found was the infants who did the best by far were the infants who went to the relatives. I mean, the kids who went to the foster parents didn't do any better developmentally. Remember, these are babies. They didn't do any better developmentally than the kids who stayed with their parents. And so this may sound very non-intuitive, but this is a very careful study and a very large study by a group of researchers who were very, very credible. So there's no question. So remember, this is, again, it's a single study, but it's also a very unusual study, a very powerful one. And so why weren't the outcomes better for the kids who went into foster care with hopefully nurturing, affectionate foster parents compared to the kids who stayed with their drug-involved birth mother? The main reason was that the kids in foster care were not stable a lot of the time. That is, even when they were infants, they were being moved from one home to another within the foster care system. So if you have foster care systems that can't stabilize kids in care, they're not going to help kids in care developmentally. That's just a basic kind of a rule here. And so the most disturbing thing about that study was that, of course, these were infants. So these kids being moved around in care, it wasn't because they had behavioral issues or even because they had some kind of congenital health problems or something like that. It had to do more with system factors, with how many kids were in the home and what other kids were in the foster homes and so forth. But so no, the kids and relatives with relatives in that study did better. There have been some other studies that have found that that's just not true. And of course, the main thing that's happened in recent years is the unwelcome discovery of many people in child welfare systems that kinship care providers are no more able to stabilize behaviorally troubled kids in care than non-kin providers. That is, there used to be an idea that we could reduce the number of kids in residential care and maybe in foster care in general by just increasing the number of kids in kinship care. But remember, half the kids who go into foster care have behavior problems. Kinship care providers have been no more able to stabilize those kids than non-kinship care providers have been. So this is why this is one of these wish fulfillment fantasies in child welfare that hasn't worked out and that has had tremendous negative impact. So what else do we know about kinship care on average? We know that on average, the families are poorer. We know that they're older. I mean, a lot of times it's grandparents who are taking the kids, right? And so a lot of times these are families that really have a need for economic assistance and help. And a lot of times they aren't getting it, not anywhere near to the same extent of kids in the foster care system and so forth, right? So anyway, there's a lot of literature there on kinship care, and so somewhat more likely for siblings to be kept together in kinship care placements compared to non-kin placements. That's been another kind of finding there. Though I do have to say just one more thing on this subject, and I want to kind of get across the idea of the complexity of this subject. It's not easy to reduce this subject to ideological simplifications. But so one of the things that used to disturb me when I worked in child welfare systems and then later on in research as well, there's a lot of kids who are in, so one study found, for example, that 1 out of 6 kids in foster care when they were 16 years old, 15, 16 years old, entered care in the first 3 or 4 years of life. So there were lots of kids who, for one reason or another, seemed to be growing up in foster care. And then on closer look at those kids, it was discovered that many of them had been placed in kinship care placements when they were young. And those kinship care placements had been stable for some time. And then the kids got older, they had behavior problems. The relatives had health issues, could not take care of the kids any longer. The kids came back into care as adolescents and they ended up aging out of care. So a lot of failed placements in foster care, some of those are kinship care placements as well as in the non-kin placements, right? a study of reentry into care that was published within the last year, this Chapin Hall study. I can send you guys a study if you want to, around the reentry into care rate from guardianship is about 1 in 5. So, and many of those guardianships, of course, are with relatives. The reentry into care rate from non-kin, from reunification in that study was 27% over a period of a few years. So higher rates of reentry into care for reunification than for the guardianships, but still a pretty high rate of reentry into care for the guardianships as well. So let me stop and see if you have other thoughts and questions there. And a couple of points I want to make, because we're going to run out of time here. So there are a couple of points I do want to make here. Okay, child welfare systems here are kind of at a crossroads. Maybe all of you kind of know this intuitively. Maybe you've read stuff we're at a point in time where there's a very influential group of people in this country who want to completely abolish the child welfare system entirely and completely, from its laws through every aspect of it, through AFSA, through adoption, through the whole bit in time. A lot of that has to do with dissatisfaction with what's happened to kids in foster care, particularly dissatisfaction with what's happened to Black and Native American kids in foster care. So those kids on average have had longer lengths of stay, and the longer lengths of stay is associated with more placements and with a greater likelihood of being mistreated or maltreated in foster care and with aging out of care. So a lot of the very worst outcomes of foster care systems have fallen disproportionately on Black and Native American kids. I mean, not just the issue of how many rates of care, but of what happens to kids when they are in care. So there's a very powerful movement now in the last few years that the federal government and some foundations have bought into, which is let's eliminate what I refer to as residential care. They usually call it congregate care. And so far as we can, let's eliminate non-kin foster care, and to the extent that we can, entirely and completely. And a lot of the criticisms, of course, as I already said, of what goes on with behaviorally troubled kids in care are valid. Those are valid kind of concerns here, right? The question is, at a policy level, what do we do about that? And so I guess what I've tried to advocate for in recent years is that there need to be very concentrated efforts here to improve the quality of foster care systems, rather than trying to eliminate them. And and that also means that we're probably going to need to retain a capacity for a certain amount of residential care, as questionable and as a lot of times literally unsafe that has been for mostly teenage youth in this country. Still, we probably are going to need to make an investment in residential care. We also need, in my opinion, to invest in professional foster care. Why do we need to do that? We need foster care that actually helps kids, that actually developmentally helps them, not just protects their lives. That's what it does for young kids. Foster care protects their lives, and there's some good evidence that that's so. But when you get to the behaviorally troubled kids, we need better foster care systems. And so the end result then of trying to disinvest in residential care and in refusing to even consider the professional foster care issue in this state has been that last year there were over 2,000 nights of hotel placements in Washington State. 2,000 nights. Hundreds of kids have been moved on a 24-hour basis from one home to another at the cost of $300 to $600 a night. The hotel placements cost over $2,000 a night a kid. And there is now a federal class action lawsuit, a court order telling the state to stop doing that. The state is continuing to do it. In fact, has done even more of it in recent months because it doesn't have any kind of alternatives there at this point in time. So there really is a policy decision now what to do about this. We're either going to try to improve foster care systems so they actually are therapeutic for behaviorally troubled kids, that they can stabilize kids in care. They can provide nurturing and safe caregiving. They can provide good mental health services for kids. They can do all of those things. But there are going to have to be some investments for that to become true, versus just simply trying to eliminate them, trying to tear them down and taking whatever the consequences are. And the consequences, contrary to what a lot of child advocates think and seem to believe, it's not going to be that the kids are going back to the birth parents. The birth parents can't handle the behaviorally troubled kids any more than the foster parents can a lot of the time. You know, when I was a child welfare manager, a lot of times in past years, many of the kids we placed out of the home weren't placed because of child protection issues. They were placed because of behavior problems or developmental disabilities. Many times they were placed because parents were pressuring us to place the kids. They were saying, I can't take, parents refusing to go to emergency rooms to pick kids up. Parents refusing to go to juvenile detention to pick kids up after they had been detained for some juvenile offense or something. So there is a group of kids in this state that are going to need some kind of out-of-home care. And the question is, at a policy level, what kind of foster care system is going to be available for those kids? And also, and I want to say this again, for the very little kids, we currently do not have a good in-home alternative to foster care for many of those kids, and particularly the chronically maltreated group. And I don't mean just the severely maltreated group, I mean particularly the chronically neglected group of kids. We don't have good in-home safety plan alternatives for that group of kids at this point. We really do need a foster care system. And a better foster care system is going to mean that we are going to have to change the business model. We are never going to have a good foster care system based on volunteer foster parents solely. So that doesn't mean that all foster parents have to be professionals. It just means that possibly anywhere from 1 in 10 to 1 in 5, you know, somewhere in the 10 to 15% range. For the most part in this country, maybe somewhere between 7 to 10% of kids at this point are in residential care facilities in this country. And that is a big reduction from past years. My version of things is we're not going to get that. There's no way that we know of at this point to get that percentage down any further safely. I don't even think that what's happened at this point in terms of reducing the number and the rate of kids in residential care has been done safely. I don't believe that it has. On the other hand, so we have these kids, and what that concretely means in this state, we have about, out of 1.7 million kids, we probably have about 300 to 400 kids who are tying up the entire child welfare foster care system in the state because we have no adequate answers and responses for those kids. We have undermined the residential care capacity in this state. That's been done on purpose by public policy. We don't have a cadre of professional foster parents by and large. We have some foster parents who identify as professional foster parents. We have some people like that who are kind of barely holding the system together insofar as it's functioning at all. It's those kind of folks, right? So that's really a kind of a public policy kind of a decision here. And at the same time, we need to be investing in services that will actually make it safe for kids to be able to remain in the home. So here, what people are doing at the advocacy level, it seems like to me, is they're substituting rhetoric for actual action and for services. It's possible to protect more kids within the family setting, but we actually have to have services, safety-oriented services to do that. And what that means is that we have to have safety monitors. We have to have therapeutic childcare programs that kids can go to during the day. We have to have the kind of facilities where young mothers can live with their babies while they're in substance abuse treatment. All those things are possible. All those things are affordable. But they all cost money. Rhetoric is cheap. It's also dangerous. And so we're actually now at a point in this state where that kind of rhetoric is actually hurting kids. It's hurting kids there because we're not providing the kind of services that it would take to make sure that kids are safe when they're in their own home. But we're talking about the evils of foster care to the extent that now I think I'm hearing stories where courts are actually being quite influenced to send kids home before it's likely that they will be safe, to reunify as quickly as possible, even when there are very severe problems within the family. So those are dangerous courses of action. And that's kind of what happens when, you know, child welfare discussions get reduced to these ideological kind of battles. with absolutely complete, almost disregard for research here, and then people being absolutely convinced that they're right, based on what, so anyway, maybe I'll stop there and give people a chance for comments or questions here. Yes, now this issue of Pauline asked studies. I have written a number of commentaries on foster care over the years. Every one of those commentaries at the end has a list of references and studies that I use in the commentary. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send some of these commentaries to you, and you can look at the ref. If you're interested in the studies, you can go back and look in the reference section, right? And so at the same time, I am going to send Ryan some more comments about the nature of these studies, because remember, there are dozens of these studies. Now, one of them I wrote in 2007, almost 15 years ago. I wrote a summary of research on foster care outcomes. That is quite a 20-page kind of summary, right? I will send that summary to Ryan, and he can send it to you as well. And that summary probably discusses a dozen studies. There has been another summary. Another summary was done in 2009 by researchers in another state. Another one in 2016 with very similar kind of conclusions there. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to send Ryan some of the information about these studies. And if you're interested in them, you can kind of go back and look there. So, and I'd be very glad to, Ryan can give you my email address, or maybe I'll give you my email address, deewilson13@aol.com. And you can also mail me questions or comments, and they can be critical comments as long as they're civil, and you don't have to agree with me or anything. I'm very willing to respond to arguments or whatever that is, as well as to give you information about studies and I also, by the way, have a number of these studies. So insofar as I have them, I will send some of them to Ryan, and he can forward them on to you, right? So anyway, any idea how we can access child welfare research without a university connection? Okay, Carolyn asked this. So this is very much of an issue for me. And because I used to have the university connection, but I don't anymore. So I have the same difficulty as probably all of you do. So just a couple of ideas here real quick. I subscribe to something that all of you can subscribe to, which is free, which is called Child Welfare News, and it's from the Child Welfare Gateway. And these are news bulletins that come out daily, Monday through Friday, every day of the week. And they include lots of information from child welfare systems across the country, and they include lots of information about reports and studies that are free. You can also sign up for something that's called Quick Links, which is also from the Child Welfare Gateway. And these usually involve, they give you links to studies or reports from journals that are willing to allow those to be sent out for free. And there's a lot of those articles and reports that are sent out for free. So one of the things I do practically every day of the week, I send out studies. I get from these sources a lot of times. In addition, I pay something less than $100 a year to belong to a group called Academia. And so it's online, and they have access to, dozens of journals. And they frequently, weekly, they send me articles without even me asking for it. So all of you can sign, it's not much, and you can write it off on taxes. So it doesn't cost a lot of money. It still isn't the same thing as having a university affiliation where you have access to all those peer-reviewed journals and studies. And so this is very frustrating for me, as I'm sure it is for you. And so I have a couple of friends in universities that when I want one of those studies, I make a request, and they frequently will send me the study. But sometimes I'm kind of reluctant to ask them because I don't want to bug them or something, right? So sometimes I go and I pay for it. But at $35 a study, anywhere from $20 to $35 a study, that gets to be expensive very, very quickly. So not having the university affiliation is really tough. So one of the things you might think about, Ryan, is CASA getting subscription to a couple of, there are only 3 or 4 or 5 main child welfare journals in the country. and getting a show offer subscription, so you guys have access. You can do online subscriptions that are a lot cheaper than getting the paper version of that. And that would be a very good way to expend a few $100s worth of funds there, and be very, very helpful. It's very frustrating to have a study referenced and then not be able to access a study, right? So I empathize with all of you who have difficulty with that, right? So anyway, what I'm going to do, this is Friday. And so by Monday or Tuesday of next week, I will begin to send some of this kind of information to Ryan. It won't be all at once because I have a lot of information. And generally in past years when I've done this, generally I start to overwhelm people to the point where maybe it's not really a good thing to be doing at times. But anyway, I'm going to send you the studies. There's many of them as I have, along with some of the summaries of studies that I've already mentioned here. And I encourage you to go back and look at a few of these studies. So, one of the things I found is that brief summaries of studies are good, but it's not the same thing as reading the study. And so sometimes you just learn so much more if you have access to the study. And one of the things I found a lot of times is that if you want to know whether a study is worth reading, you read the introduction and you read the discussion. You read the beginning and the end. And if you're interested in the beginning and the end of the study, then you read the rest of the study. But a lot of studies aren't worth reading. You can tell in the first few sentences or in the discussion section that it's a waste of time. So I go through a lot of articles in less than 5 minutes to decide the ones that I want to read carefully. And then once I have an important study, I read it really carefully and then I reread it. And so that's the way that I have found is the most useful at sort of incorporating, assimilating the research here, right? Getting subscriptions. And in past years, I tried to get the University of Washington School of Social Work to do this for caseworkers in the state, and they just wouldn't do it. They just wouldn't do it. And so they had a library. It's just so frustrating but of course the agency could go back and do that for caseworkers. They just don't value research enough to do it. But of course they could. But anyway, you can get the news bulletins. That's free. You get those every day, Monday through Friday. You can get the quick links. That's free. Those come out on a monthly basis. That has a lot of times 20, 30, 40 reports that you have links to there. And so that's a good place to start. And then I recommend the Academia thing because it's not much money. It's under $100 a year. And you get access to lots of journals and lots of articles there. And then I think it's also very helpful to be able to ask scholars questions. So for example, over the years, Jill Barrick is a famous foster care researcher at Berkeley, and I've become kind of friends with her. And when I have a question about research, I just send her an email question and she always responds. She always responds. So, so that's the other thing. You can actually very good possibility of actually developing an online kind of relationship with some of these key researchers in the country. And I can send Ryan a brief list of who those people would be there. So anyway, so that's kind of for starters. When I send you the sounding board stuff, remember, you want to look, if you're interested in the articles, you want to look to the reference list. Look at the references at the end of the list, and that will give you the studies that I used to pull together the commentary. Okay, let me stop. It's 10 minutes after, and let me see if there's any more comment or question here. We had talked with Ryan before this started. So next month, we'll probably come back to the subject of multiple placements because I've been very interested in that subject over the years. At one point, when I was still with the agency, I wrote a very lengthy article on that led to my ultimate being pressured out of the agency because the powers that be were so unhappy with that. So I have an interest in this subject. It's a super important subject and issue. And so next month on the Friday, we're going to come back and talk about in more depth the issue of multiple placements of children. So anyway, thanks for everyone. So
Thank you so much, Dee. Have a great weekend.